Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We're delighted to welcome you to the Washington Hebrew Congregation Scholar Series, and we're very indebted to our chair, Leslie Maitland, for bringing us such wonderful opportunities. We're also indebted this morning to the Goodman family through the WHC Leo and Elizabeth Goodman Public Issues Endowment Fund. They're pleased to co-sponsor Professor Ross's lecture today, which draws attention to the issues of Nazism in our midst. Leo and Elizabeth Goodman were longtime members of Washington Hebrew Congregation, a pair of dedicated social activists. Their two daughters, Joan Churchill and Lois Ontel, are present today, and many of their family members. I would just like the members of the family just to raise their hand so I get a count on, so I make sure I don't offend any of them. So I'm going to go off script for a second. Leo and Elizabeth were more than just social activists, and it's so appropriate that they sponsor this. They came to Washington during the New Deal. And like some of the characters in this book, their commitment to making America stronger, their commitment to doing what was right and just was actually phenomenal. Elizabeth created the Visitation Instruction Corps here in Washington. Both were social activists, and their two daughters ended up being two real slouches. Lois Ontel, an attorney who's argued before the Supreme Court, and Joan Churchill, who we often have to remember to call her Judge Joan Churchill, who served distinguishedly as a judge for us in these United States. So we want to thank the Goodman family and to thank both of for you and for the generations of support. Disinformation, fake news, a subversive government seeking to influence American politics. Fox News, CNN, New York Times. No, the subplot of Professor Stephen J. Ross's Hitler in Los Angeles. A riveting account of Leon Lewis and his work in America to prevent a Nazi invasion, to prevent Nazism from spreading, and to safeguard, an important point, not the Jews in America, but to safeguard, as a Jew, America. This is, I told Stephen Ross, Professor Ross, I'm angry with him. I like to skim books. You will not be able to skim this book, nor will you be able to put it down, and I'm going to start pushing for him because I know he owns the movie rights, and I'm looking for a part to maybe change my career. This is a fabulous book. I'm a student of Jacob Ryder Marcus and read many of these books and am disturbed by their lack of attentiveness to historical detail. This is an exceptional book on all counts. Stephen J. Ross is a professor of history at USC, the first in his family to go to college. Stephen received his BA from Columbia University, a Bachelor of Philosophy from Oxford University, and a PhD from Princeton University. You know he had Jewish parents. Professor Ross has written extensively in areas of working class history, social history, film history, and political history. His first book, Workers on the Edge, Work, Leisure, and Politics in Industrializing Cincinnati, 1788 to 1890, was adapted for a screen by Cincinnati Unionists and made into a documentary entitled They Build the City. He's been quoted in so many newspapers. He's been listed on the best books of 1998. He has been nominated for a Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award in History. And his latest book, Hollywood, Left and Right, How Movie Stars Shaped American Politics, received a Pulitzer Prize nomination and a Film Scholars Award from the Academy of Motion Picture Arts. Without further ado, I'd like to give to you Professor Stephen J. Ross to present Hitler in Los Angeles, and I can't wait.
Thank you, Rabbi, and thank you all for coming. Can you hear me? Okay, the mic's working. You can never tell. No?
You never ask a Jewish question, a crowd of Jewish.
No, well, you can't hear the story if you can't hear me speak, can you? I want to tell you a story today.
Let's just make a switch. This will work for sure.
I want to tell you a story today that you've never heard before. And it's a story about the past that has resonance in the present. It's a story about a time in American history when hate groups moved from the margins to the mainstream of society, and when American government authorities seemed either complacent or complicit. And we start our story with this map. When I first showed it to my wife, she said, "But I can't read the street signs." And I said, "That's not the point." It's a map I designed with one of my colleagues, just showing you a small part of Nazi and fascist Los Angeles. Everything you see there in the red is either Nazis or fascists. And it's over on the far right is downtown, and you see only one Jewish star, Leon Lewis's headquarters. When you see this, the top image is not Nazi Germany. For those of you who know Los Angeles, it's Figueroa and West 15th Street. It's now a parking lot for the convention center. And more frightening yet, this is downtown Los Angeles. And you see the Los Angeles furniture store. Right outside, our swastika flag flying proudly. Hitler became Reich's Chancellor in January 1933. And he sent to Los Angeles early on Captain Robert Pape, actually I'll move one ahead, in March 1933 to organize Nazis in Los Angeles and along the entire West Coast. In late July, July 26, 1933, Nazis held their first open meeting in Los Angeles wearing brown shirts, swastikas, and they proclaimed that they were going to save America from the dual menace of communism and Jews. Now, Jewish groups, the idea that Jews didn't do anything is totally wrong. Jews did a great deal. They immediately began a debate of how to oppose Hitler, but they had a divided strategy. Do we get in Hitler's face? And that was the American Jewish Congress, led by Stephen Wise, and they launched an international boycott of all German products until Hitler would stop persecuting minorities. Or do we work behind the scenes, which was the American Jewish Committee that argued Hitler would only double down on his persecution of Jews if you got in his face? Well, while Jews were debating, within days of the Nazis holding their first open meeting, Leon Lewis decided enough talk, it was now time for action. Leon Lewis was a Midwesterner born in the late 1880s in Wisconsin, wound up going to law school in Chicago, graduated in 1913, and just as he graduated, a group was starting the Anti-Defamation League, and he became the founding executive secretary in what was then a three-man operation. He went off to war, went in as an enlisted man, came back as a captain, went back to the ADL and told them of the hate that I've seen in Europe, and said, we need to start monitoring anti-Semitism. So in 1921, he also became the founding executive secretary of the ADL's International Division. Well, in 1931, for various health reasons, he moved to Los Angeles. He remained the ADL's representative to Southern California, and he also remained someone who, starting in 1915, he was working as the ADL's representative to the motion picture industry. So he was working with the moguls for decades. As soon as the Nazis held their first open meeting, I just want to see so I don't talk too long, I am Jewish. As soon as the Nazis held their first open meeting, he said, enough is enough. He was a veteran, and just about a mile and a half from downtown, the county had built the Patriotic Hall. And if you drive through LA now and you're on the 10 and you're approaching downtown, you can't miss it. It says Bob Hope Patriotic Hall. And it was meant to house veterans groups. And he was a member of both the Disabled American Veterans and the American Legion. And he went down to the Disabled American Veterans. And his first recruit was John Schmidt. John Schmidt was a German-born son of a German general. His brother was a high-ranking officer in the German army. He had been a German cadet, and in 1916 left Germany, came to America, lied about his age, joined the army, fought with General Pershing in Mexico, and then fought in World War I against his own family. Leon Lewis knew he was going to be the typical recruit that they would want. In fact, Lewis, because there's probably no American who was following Hitler's rise to power in the 1920s more carefully than Leon Lewis, it was both his job and his passion. And he knew that Hitler was going to duplicate, or Hitler's minions in America were going to duplicate the strategy Hitler had used in the 1920s with his brown shirts, which is recruit military veterans who had fought for their country, who had been patriots, and had been thrown on the ash heap of history. Our government, governments around the world are always very happy to recruit men to fight in wars, and once they come home, they're forgotten. And many of the men Hitler recruited were bitter because they had served their nation, whether right or wrong, they had served their country, and their military benefits had been cut to almost nothing. And they knew that in America the same thing was happening. When Roosevelt took over in March 1933, one of the first things he and Congress did was pass the Economy Act, which cut military veteran benefits that had been $80 to $100 a month to $20 a month, or in many cases nothing. And there were many veterans who were furious at our government. And the Nazis thought, these are the guys we're going to recruit. And we're going to recruit military veterans who then can teach angry Americans what to do. And so Leon Lewis got John Schmidt, Captain Carl Sunderland, an American who had been a lifetime military officer, Major Burt Allen, and his one Jewish spy, who didn't last very long because they just didn't want a Jew in there, William Conley, who was the national commander of the disabled American veterans. Leon Lewis went to them and said, look, I want all of you to go undercover with your wives. These were husband and wife spy teams, and join every Nazi and fascist group in Los Angeles and try to rise to positions of power and influence, and then send me back daily reports. And the book I've written is based on over 200 boxes of those reports. And to the extent I can, I try to tell the story from their point of view in real time, because none of these men knew what was going to happen. None of their wives knew what was going to happen. They didn't know there was going to be a war. They didn't know that there was going to be a Holocaust. But after attending a number of Nazi meetings, what they knew are these people were ready to kill Jews. And in fact, in Charlottesville, we read the horror of white supremacists and neo-Nazis, screaming out, the Jews will not replace us. But from 1933, and I'm sorry to tell you, well through Pearl Harbor to 1945, virtually every week or at least every month after Pearl Harbor, one group was calling for death to Jews. Not the Jews will replace us, death to Jews. They started their spy operation. Hermann Schwinn, here on the left in the light suit, was the head of what was then called the Friends of New Germany, that became the German-American Bund. The Nazis operated in daylight. They weren't trying to kid anybody what they were up to. They opened the Aryan Bookstore that was getting in propaganda sent on boats from Germany. They had the latest German newspapers, pamphlets, and anti-Semitic literature and anti-communist literature. And you can see the broken window, because there were some groups in LA that did not think this was such a good idea. They had their own, and here's the other thing. I wanted to show you this photo because in our minds, many of us think of Nazis as wearing brown shirts and, just raising their arm and being crazy men. These are very rational men. In fact, Hans Winterhalter had a small role in a 1920s movie in Hollywood, but just didn't want to deal with Jews. So that was the end of his movie career. And Paul Themlitz was the original number 2 man and the owner of the Aryan Bookstore. Well, within weeks, literally within weeks of going undercover, John Schmidt's wife had risen to become the head of the Women's Auxiliary for the Friends of New Germany and was asked to translate secret memos coming in and out of Germany. which she did, translated into English, and then sent everything to Leon Lewis. But they uncovered a plot to seize armories in San Francisco, Los Angeles, and San Diego. And on a certain day, Dietrich Gefgen, who had fled, had been one of Hitler's originally brown shirts out of the Munich 1920s, had fled Germany because he had shot to death 2 communist Jews in the 1920s, had gone to San Francisco, had joined the National Guard, had blueprints for the entire National Guard of where all the guns and ammunition was kept, got the same from San Diego, and had asked Lewis's spies to get the blueprints and to get machine guns from the LA Armory. At which point Leon Lewis said, this is too dangerous. Now, Leon Lewis never planned to be a vigilante. He never planned to run a spy ring. In his mind, he would gather enough evidence of Nazi plots for sabotage and murder and turn it over to the authorities, who were far better equipped. So the first person he went to see was Police Chief James Two Gun Davis, known as Two Gun because he won the National Police Pistol Championship with both his right hand and his left hand. He was the one responsible for that infamous phrase, shoot first, ask questions later. So Leon Lewis writes a memo, and this comes from his memo, and I can tell you, 90 years later, I could feel the heat coming out of the memo. He writes a memo of his meeting with Police Chief Davis, saying he started telling Davis about the plots, and 2 minutes into his description of what the Nazis were about to do, Davis stopped them and said, you don't get it. Hitler's doing what he needs to do to save Germany from the Jews. The Jews have caused all the problems in Germany. And in fact, in LA, the real problem aren't these Nazis and their brethren, their American equivalents, the silver shirts. The real problem are those people in Boyle Heights, which was the Jewish neighborhood, those communists in Boyle Heights. And he let Lewis know that as far as he was concerned, every communist was a Jew, and every Jew was a communist. And he basically threw him out of the office. Lewis then went to Sheriff Biscaluse, and what we have here is an autographed photograph sent by the Nazi counsel in Los Angeles, George Gissling, to his good friend, Sheriff Biscaluse. Biscaluse told him nothing I could do, in part because literally dozens, if not hundreds, of members of the LAPD and the Sheriff's Department were either active members of the Silver Shirts, who were the American equivalent of the Nazis, or were incredibly sympathetic to them. He then went to Lewis then went to the FBI, and they told him there's nothing we can do unless we're ordered from Washington. And J. Edgar Hoover had no desire to tail Nazis and fascists. All he cared about were these Hollywood Jew commies. Well, Lewis was faced with a problem. He had started the spy ring at the very end of July, early August. He had basically given up his law practice, and he was paying all his undercover agents a very modest stipend because many of them were unemployed, and he was running out of money. And he knew no authorities were going to help, and so he needed to raise funds to sustain his operation. And he went to some of Hollywood's biggest moguls, Louis B. Mayer, Irving Thalberg, Jack Warner, and two of the more important people, Rabbi Edgar Magnin, head of the Wilshire Boulevard Temple, the largest temple and most important temple in LA. It was also the temple of the movie stars. It was the Hollywood temple. And Mendel Silverberg. How many of you have heard of Lew Wasserman? Well, imagine Lew Wasserman on steroids. Mendel Silverberg was the most powerful entertainment attorney in America. He represented most of the studios. He was the personal attorney to most of the moguls, and he was the attorney to most of the movie stars. He also was one of the 5 Republican kingmakers in the 20s. That is, when they went into that proverbial back room at the convention, he was one of the 5 people who decided who the GOP candidate for president would be. And Mendel agreed that he would chair this oversight committee, and he would get Lewis the money. And on March 13th, 1934, imagine 40 limousines pull up to the Hillcrest Country Club, which had been founded in 1920 because Jews had been excluded from either excluded or thrown out of every country club in the city. And they wanted a place to golf, to play tennis, and most of all to schmooze in the morning. Bagels, lox on a Sunday. And of course, once the irony is when they started construction of the golf course and started digging, they hit oil. They became the wealthiest country club in the city. And so Mendel had told these men to show up, but wouldn't tell them why. And they showed up, they walk into the country club, they're escorted into a private dining room that has 40 chairs. And in front of every chair, a copy of the Silver Ranger, which was the newspaper put out by the Silver Shirts, again, the American fascists. And these newspapers had incredibly anti-Semitic articles, particularly attacking the Hollywood moguls. Here you have boycott the movies, Hollywood is the Sodom and Gomorrah. We read about these scandals. Harvey Weinstein is not new. Harvey Weinstein is a sad but old story. And it's, once again, the raping of innocent Christian women by the moguls. There's no question what the religion of that man is. Leon Lewis knew that these were hardscrabble men, that they weren't going to give him money just because he was a fellow Jew. And so he decided he was going to shock them into generosity. And he proceeded to tell them, you all pay attention to what we call today above-the-line Hollywood. That is, the names that appear at the beginning of a movie, the actors, directors, the writers, the producers. He said, none of you are paying attention to below-the-line Hollywood, where 70 to 80% of your studio employees work, the craftsmen who build the sets, who do the sound, all these things. He said, I want to tell you, there's been a movement for the last several years. Every Jew is being fired in your studio. Studio foremen are either members or sympathetic to the Silver Shirts, and right now Paramount is virtually 100% Aryan. Louis, your studio, Mr. Jew, is almost 100% Aryan below the line. And he gave them evidence of this. By the end of the evening, the moguls had given him the equivalent of $434,000 in 2017 dollars to fund his operation and promised that they would do it as long as he needed the money. Well, I want to tell you what they discovered over the next several years were plots, mass murder plots of Jews. They discovered a plot to drive through Boyle Heights, the Jewish neighborhood, with machine guns and shoot as many Jews as they could. They discovered plots to create a phony fumigation company that would pump in cyanide whenever they got an order from a Jewish home. And they discovered plots to blow up military installations all along the Pacific coast. I want to talk to you today about two of the more horrendous plots. And the first one starts in late 1935, early 1936. And the key person in both of those plots is Chuck Slocum, known as Agent C-19. Leon Lewis, in the records, it took me quite a while to figure out this story because he operated on a need-to-know basis. And in the archives, they'd never mentioned the names of any of the spies. You have to figure them out. Because he thought if the Nazis ever broke in and discovered his records, because they all knew where he was, and he was called the most dangerous Jew in Los Angeles. They knew where his law office was. They would post men outside his law office to try to see if they could determine who was coming in and out. Because from the beginning, they knew Leon Lewis was spying on them. They just didn't know who the spies were. Chuck Slocum was one of his more extraordinary spies. Long Beach, water taxi driver who had been a longtime member of the Klan, mainly because you had a lot of people who joined the Klan, not necessarily because they hated blacks and Jews, but because they hated communists. And by the late 20s, when Chuck Slocum realized that this hatred was not just against commies, but other Americans, he couldn't abide it, and he was working undercover for the police captain in Long Beach, and then for Leon Lewis. And he discovered a plot by Ingram Hughes. And in 1935, Ingram Hughes, who was a lapsed lawyer and worked as a linotype operator for the LA Times, got 2 or 3 of his friends to insert this proclamation in the Sunday Morning Times. Imagine you get the newspaper delivered, you open it up, and here's a proclamation that talks about he wants to, quote, create the final solution, that's what he called it, to the Jewish problem in America that we can't do by any legislative means. And that final solution was going to be let's see if we can get rid of that, no internet. Well, I don't need the internet. Okay. The final solution was he was going to bomb the homes of 20 famous figures in LA, including Busby Berkeley, who I didn't know was Jewish until I wrote this, Justices Mendel Silverberg and Leon Lewis. And he had recruited men from the White Russians, from the Nazis, from the Silver Shirts, all of whom were carefully plotting how to blow up these homes. And what Hughes had said to Slocum is, the minute we blow up these homes, it's going to start pogroms throughout America. There will be bloodbaths of Jews in every major city in America because it's going to steel up those who hate the Jews to do something about it. Franz Franz, who was the head of Nazi publicity for the entire West Coast, was one of those people. There's his San Quentin picture, where he would wind up later on. This will be the next one. Anyway, Chuck Slocum convinced them. They all knew that Leon Lewis, and they all, meaning the Nazi leaders, knew Leon Lewis had spies inside their organization. The Silver Shirts knew Leon Lewis had spies inside their organization. They just couldn't figure out who they were. And in fact, Chuck Slocum said to his boss there, he said, look, Hughes, Ingram, Jews have spies. If we do this, they're going to know who did it, and we're going to be arrested for murder. Let's postpone this until we can figure out who the spy is. So he postponed it forever. But the next plot came a year later, in 1937. Leopold McLaughlin, who you can see all the way on the left, cramped up. And if he looks like he's cramped in that seat, he is. He's somewhere between 6'6" and 6'8". He is one of the 7 McLaughlin brothers, the most famous being Victor McLaughlin, who won an Oscar for The Informer. Leopold was a con man, but he was a deadly con man. He had fought in the British Army in the Boer War. He fought in World War I. He rose to the rank of captain, and he became at one point the world's jiu-jitsu champion, having defeated the Japanese champion. He taught jiu-jitsu at Scotland Yard. He taught jiu-jitsu to the Sûreté in France. And in LA, he had come to LA. He wasn't able to break into the movies because his brother had blackballed him, saying, my brother's crazy, have nothing to do with him. But he found a receptive audience here of fascists, fellow fascists and Nazis. This is a home in LA, up in the hills, and up in the balcony is one of the sheriff captain, Frank Gompert, who was one of his right-hand men. And after meeting a group of fascists, including Henry Allen, who was the first fascist family of Los Angeles, his wife was the head of the Women's Auxiliary of the Silver Shirts. His son was thrown out of junior high for trying to recruit his junior high comrades into the junior Silver Shirts. He wound up in San Quentin at one point. Allen was very close to Chuck Slocum and proudly told him about, he carried in his car, I don't know if you can see, all the way on the door there at the bottom, there's like what looks like a kind of stick. And that's what he called his kite killer. And he pulled his car over one day and said to Chuck, come on here, I'm going to show you how you kill Jews. And he showed him how first you take the kite killer, you hit the Jew in the stomach. When they bend over, you hit them in the head as hard as you can. And at the very least, you'll crack their skull, and if you're lucky, they'll be dead. And a third man that was part of the plot was Ken Alexander, the leading still photographer, studio photographer in Hollywood, who hated the Jews and became the head of the Silver Shirts. And one night in the fall of 1937, after they met at a German Day picnic, he invited these three men back to the House of O'Sullivan on Sunset Boulevard. And over Tom Collins and scotches and sodas, he told them, he said, I have a bloody good idea, and bloody it was. He was going to assassinate 24 Hollywood leaders. He was going to have men kidnap them and then shoot them. And his belief, and this was included Samuel Goldwyn, Louis B. Mayer, Jack Warner, and two movie stars who he said were known to be too friendly to Jews. And that was Charlie Chaplin and James Cagney, who many of you may not know spoke fluent Yiddish. He had worked in a Jewish store earlier on. And the idea was, at that point, Charlie Chaplin was the most famous man in the world. And after he assassinated these 24 Hollywood leaders, he, like Ingram Hughes, believed there would be pogroms throughout America, that he believed anti-Semites were just waiting for the right moment to rise up and get rid of the Jewish menace in America. Well, once again, Chuck Slocum proved to be the hero of the day. Chuck Slocum, so imagine, here's what went down. They're sitting in this restaurant, the House of O'Sullivan. Leopold McLaughlin was, by the way, this is the German Day Parade. This is, the publishers wanted to put this on the cover, and I said no, because this could be Nazi Germany. This is a park 17 miles northeast of Los Angeles, known as Hindenburg Park, that was eventually changed its name to La Crescenta, which seemed much less offensive. But you had Nazis there. By the way, in this park you had Nazi summer camps for boys and girls who were trained in National Socialism. You also had Deutsche Haus, which was the Nazi headquarters. This on, again, 15th Street and Figueroa in downtown LA. So McLaughlin dictates 24 names. Henry Allen writes down those names and then gives the list to Ken Alexander. And Alexander says, this time we're going to outsmart the Jews. They're never going to catch us. And he rips the list in half. And he gives half to Chuck Slocum. And he says, I'm putting this, the Jews will never find it. I'm going to put it in my photographic plates, in between two plates, put it underneath my mattress, and this time I'm much smarter than those Jews. And of course, Slocum goes home and immediately calls Leon Lewis. They didn't want to take a chance. And so Lewis had Slocum convince Henry Allen and Ken Alexander that in fact McLaughlin was going to carry out this plot. They would murder the Jews, and then McLaughlin would turn state's evidence against them and escape and have them hung for killing all these people. And so they went to the district attorney, although Leon Lewis had warned them in advance. Slocum convinced the other two this was going to happen. They went to the DA. They have affidavits, which I have in my possession, telling them the plot about McLaughlin. McLaughlin went to trial, but he was only tried for extortion, because he was in fact extorting a Santa Barbara millionaire. They never put the death plot in the newspapers. It appeared in one or two papers, Jewish papers. Somebody leaked it. But Leon was playing the long game, because he knew that both the police and sheriff's office had men involved in this plot, and that naval intelligence had been bamboozled by McLaughlin as well. And so rather than embarrass them all, he figured they're going to owe me for this, and they will believe what I have to say. So McLaughlin was convicted of extortion, sentenced to 5 years in prison, but allowed to leave the country, promising he would never return to American soil. I have one last story to tell you, and that is perhaps the most remarkable story of all. And that is the story of the German General Council sent to Los Angeles in June 1933 by Adolf Hitler and by his Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels. And George Gissling has been the villain of decades of Hollywood histories of the 30s and 40s. He was sent with one mission only, which is to stop Hollywood from making any movie that attacked or denigrated Hitler or Nazi Germany. And the threat was to impose Article 15 of the German Import Law of 1931 that said any studio that makes a picture that in any way attacks the reputation of Germany will have its pictures banned. And if enough films are made from a country, all those films from that country will be banned. Well, Germany was the second largest market in Europe next to Great Britain. And so the moguls were hoping to cooperate, and many of them felt, well, Hitler's such a buffoon, he'll be thrown out of office within a few months, that the German people will realize what they had done and get rid of him. No further comment. Or others felt, well, you know, Hitler had been really anti-Semitic to get elected, but now he was going to tone down his rhetoric and be a real leader. So Hitler watched movies every night. He enjoyed movies, and he enjoyed Hollywood films. But he felt that Hollywood was the world's leading propaganda machine. And he felt that, in fact, Germany would have done much better in World War I had the British and Hollywood not produced so many anti-German films. And he was determined, even in the early 30s, he knew what his ambitions were. He knew he was going to have territorial expansion, and he knew he had to keep America neutral for as long as possible, and that meant keeping Hollywood neutral. And Gissling's task was made a lot easier the following year when the Production Code Administration passed its own laws, self-censorship, to prevent the federal government from intervening, saying that you cannot, if you want to seal a PCA seal of approval, and you needed that to get into first-run movie theaters, and studios made 70 to 80% of their profits in first-run movie theaters. If you wanted that seal, you could not make a movie that attacked, denigrated, or mocked any foreign leader or country. So Gissling did a great job. He, in fact, prevented Hollywood. He was great at what he did. In fact, if any of you are watching the Amazon Prime series, The Last Tycoon, he makes an appearance there also as the kind of Nazi man. But I wanted to find out who this guy was, and I was particularly interested when I started the research in knowing what did LA society, high society, which was Goyshka society, what did they think of this man? And I read the social column from 1933 until Roosevelt expelled all the Jews. Roosevelt expelled all the German diplomats in July 1941. And I was taken aback because George Gissling was by far the most popular and sought-after diplomat in the entire city. He was suave, he was sophisticated, he spoke multiple languages. He had gone to a special gymnasium in Switzerland that specialized in ancient languages and cultures. He learned all of those. He received a JD as a lawyer in that time when you had to actually write a thesis, the equivalent of a PhD thesis, to get your Juris Doctorate. And I just said, this man can't be a Nazi. I just don't believe it. And sometimes historians get a feeling in their gut about something, that this just isn't what it appears to be. And I started looking through the Nuremberg records, because I figured he was brought to Nuremberg. What went down? And after months of searching, I found the smoking gun. I found a letter written to the Nuremberg prosecutors in 1947 by Brigadier General Julius Klein, who was then the highest-ranking Jew in the military, and it opened by saying, "This is the first and only time I will write a personal testimonial to a Nazi." And that is because George Gissling is not a Nazi. George Gissling has been secretly providing me with information from the moment he arrived in LA in 1933 until he left. He was giving me information about the German economy, which was much more fragile than Hitler ever admitted. He gave me information about the German-American Bund. And in 1940, when he went to a secret meeting of the major consuls and the military attachés at the Mayflower Hotel here, not far from the shul, he passed me information about German war plans. All of that, Julius Klein, in turn, sent on to General George C. Marshall. And in fact, Gissling, there's Julius Klein, Once I found out about this story, and Joe Roos on the left was Leon Lewis's associate spy master. Klein and his nephew, Joe Roos, had begun their own spy operation. Klein was a Chicago-born Jew raised in Berlin, and Joe Roos was a Viennese-born Jew raised in Berlin. And when they both went back to Chicago in the late 20s, they began spying by the early 30s on German immigrants coming over who had been brown shirts with Hitler, and continued through 33 when Hitler came to power. And at one point, Joe Roos was working as a reporter in Chicago for the Hearst newspapers, and when his editor found out about his spy operation, he asked him to write a memo that he then passed on to the publisher, Roy Keane, who was the head of the Illinois National Guard. And Keane called in Roos to his office, said, "Tell me the story." Roos told him the story, and he gave him an envelope, and he said, "Follow the instructions here, and you're going to meet somebody at the Bismarck Hotel, and whatever he tells you to do, do. Forget about your job here. This is your new job." So he went to the Bismarck Hotel. He met with an Army colonel, told him the story. The colonel said, "This is great, but you have no idea what you're doing. I'm going to have you trained by my men in counterespionage." And Roos was trained in counterespionage, and that colonel, of course, was George C. Marshall, later the head of Army Intelligence and Secretary of State. And in fact, Roos, Lewis, and Julius were sending the only government, there were only two government officials who listened to them: George Marshall and Commander Ellis Zacharias, who was one of the rarest of sorts. He was a naval a graduate of Annapolis and a Jew. And he was the head of naval intelligence for the West Coast. Gissling did an amazing job, except the Nazis hated him. The Nazis in LA were writing letters to Berlin. I had a researcher going through his personnel file in Berlin, and we found all these letters from LA saying, "George Gissling is not National Socialist. He's not tough enough, and he's not anti-Semitic enough." And at that point I realized, wait a minute, I'd never heard him make an anti-Semitic statement in the newspaper. None of the spies ever reported him making an anti-Semitic statement. And I thought, I've got to find out more. And I tracked down his daughter, who had been born in New York and left the country when she was 13. And I wound up interviewing her in Morro Bay, California. She had, after the war, married a lieutenant colonel in Air Force Intelligence, American Air Force Intelligence, and moved to California. And when I went to see her, the first thing she said is, "Thank God you're here. Somebody's going to get my father's story right." And I still, even with this letter, you think a daughter wants to always think well of her father. So I just gave her general information like, "Does the name Julius Klein ring a bell?" And she started laughing, and she said, "Yes, the little general." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Well, Julius was 5'3", 5'4", and my dad was 6'4". And when they would get together, they were a hilarious pair. And I said, "Oh, so he came to the house?" He said, "Yeah, he came to the house all the time, but it was really strange because my father would go into his study and lock the door, and they'd have dinner sent in, and my father never locked a door. Julius was the only one he ever locked a door for." And I then told her the whole story, and she said, "Now it all makes sense. Now I understand." And I said, "How did your father feel about the Jewish emigres in Los Angeles, of which there were many?" And she said, "Well, my father said, I am the German consul to Los Angeles, and they are German Jews." And he said, "I'm not an idiot. I understand they're going to all see me as a Nazi, but there were a few Jews he trusted." And she said, "We had a code. If a Jew needed help, they would call the house and they'd ask for Dr. Ginsburg. And if anyone other than my father or our housekeeper, who was secretly his mistress, picked up the phone, they'd say, 'There's no Dr. Ginsburg here.' And if he did, he would do what he could to help them." And in fact, this man who has been the villain is in fact a hero. And just to tell you briefly, I said, "So what happened after the war?" She said, "We went back to Berlin, and my father was kept in Gestapo headquarters for 3 days because they had all this information that he wasn't a real Nazi. And at this point, he had done his job, and Hitler's men didn't care as long as he stopped Hollywood. But now that he was back on German soil, he was detained, And she said he was kept under a close eye. And in 1944, when there was a thwarted plot to kill Hitler, many of his friends were part of that group. And so he had himself transferred to northern Italy, to Murano, northern Italy, and he wound up being part of, his daughter told me this, and I couldn't believe it, and found out it was true. He was part of Operation Sunrise, which was a small number of German diplomats and generals working with Allen Dulles, who was the OSS head in Bern, the OSS being the predecessor of the CIA. He worked with them to negotiate the surrender of German troops in northern Italy. And on May 6th, Gissling, along with the German troops, all surrendered to the Allies on May 8th, 1945, 4 years before I was born. Imagine, my parents are both Holocaust survivors, and they had their firstborn son 4 years after VE Day. Something else. He was kept in prison until 1947, and to anticipate one of the questions I get, why did he remain in jail for 2 years if he did all this? I think it was the only, I don't know the answer, but my guess is if he had, there were a number of military men who were sympathetic to the Nazis, American military. And if he had told somebody really the full story, and that person leaked it to the Germans in jail, he would have been killed. No question. He would have been killed immediately. And there's our general. And there's him leaving the country. So the last story I want to tell is, and that's, yes, that brings me about the right time. Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. The FBI is widely praised for rounding up all these Nazis and fascists in Los Angeles. Within 24 hours, they've arrested Hermann Schwinn, the number 2 Nazi in America. They've arrested his chief lieutenant, and they arrested roughly 100 other Nazis. They also arrested a bunch of Italian fascists and even Japanese fascists. And I said to myself, wait a minute, how's that possible? Because I got the Freedom of Information Act files for Hermann Schwinn, and there was virtually nothing. The only thing in those files were newspaper clippings. In 1940, the FBI office in LA wrote Hoover saying, you know, we need to put Hermann Schwinn under surveillance. He's the number 2 Nazi in America, and he's the head of the entire German-American Bund for the western region of the United States. And Hoover wrote back, he has broken no laws, you can't put him under surveillance. But all the FBI agents in LA were surveying Jews in Hollywood, none of whom had broken a law, none of whom had threatened our government to overthrow our government as the Nazis had. And so how did they know? Oh, by the way, Hoover finally did. After a series of explosions of sabotage, blowing up plants, munitions plants on the East Coast, in November 1941, he ordered the FBI to put Hermann Schwinn under surveillance. Middle of November, 3 weeks before Pearl Harbor. So how did they know who to arrest? Well, starting in September 1939, when the war began, Joe Roos, who joined Leon Lewis full-time after Kristallnacht, gave up his well-paying job in the studios to work for almost no money for Lewis. They began sending in names. They were compiling the names from all their spies, who were giving them names of suspects. And they divided that list into 3. Dangerous, suspicious, keep under surveillance. And every year they would update it, and every September they would send to the FBI, military and Army military intelligence, and naval intelligence these lists. So I went down to the National Archives here in College Park, and after a great deal of searching, I found the FBI memo to Army intelligence and naval intelligence with 3 lists, A, B, and C. They had simply retyped Leon Lewis's lists and claimed it as their own. And when the Attorney General sent them the list on December 7th, or the morning of December 8th, they were the Leon Lewis lists of who to arrest. But Leon Lewis never took credit for any of this. Joe Roos never took credit for any of this because they did not want anyone to think this was a Jewish operation. This was an American operation. And in fact, many of the spies who worked with them, those 4 original spies, were at one point, Leon Lewis wanted to wake up the nation, and so he had a trial arranged in 1934, and they testified about Nazi sabotage, espionage, and no one cared. And so once those spies testified, they were burned, and he kept recruiting spies after spies after spies, and found out, and in fact kept them going until after Pearl Harbor. And in fact, the last brief story is after Pearl Harbor. You know, we have this myth of the Great War, the good war, that we understood fascism, we understood the dangers of Hitler when we saw him. Nothing could be further from the truth. As late as July 1941, 2 years into the war, Gallup polls showed that 79% of Americans wanted nothing to do with what was going on in Germany. And in fact, Leon Lewis didn't trust any of the police, sheriff, or FBI, and so he kept a mother and daughter spy team, Sylvia and Grace Comfort, operating throughout the war years. And Sylvia wrote him very early on. She said, "Leon, I hate to tell you this, not a Jew, Christian, but anti-Semitism has gone up since Pearl Harbor. All these groups that were saying the Jews are going to get us into war, and when we do, we're going to get them, they're now trying to fulfill their promises." And she reported a conversation at the California Women's Republicans Club where she overheard these women saying, you know, there are too many Jewish immigrants in LA and they're taking jobs away from good Christians. And another woman said, yeah, let's hang them by the lampposts. Another woman responded, that's going to take too long. And a third woman said, well, let's sterilize all the Jews. Well, what's the take-home here? The take-home seems to me where the past and the present meet again. This was the Nazi paraphernalia seized right after Pearl Harbor. Leon Lewis finally getting an award. The take-home is there are many ways to fight an enemy, not all of which require guns. And the actions taken by Leon Lewis and his undercover operatives, I think, require us to change the way we think about Jewish resistance in the 1930s and the early 40s. With very few resources at their disposal, Lewis and his courageous group of men and women kept Los Angeles and the Pacific Coast safe. There were a number of incidents of sabotage along the East Coast. There were no major incidents of sabotage along the West Coast because Lewis foiled every single plot. I've only given you a brief taste of some of the plots. There were many more that his operatives uncovered. Now, Lewis and Roos died without ever being recognized for what they did. They went to their graves not wanting to say anything because they knew that the Nazis had pledged they would kill any of his agents they discovered working for him. And in fact, 3 of his operatives died under very suspicious circumstances. And so to their dying day, they never revealed the name. And I interviewed Joe Roos's son. He said, my father never talked about anything. The sons knew nothing. Well, Leon Lewis, I think, and Joe Roos provide us an answer with my opening, which is, what do you do when hate moves from the margins to the mainstream and the government doesn't seem willing to do anything? And the answer is that it is up to every one of us. When we hear hate, say something. When we see a demonstration by hate groups, go to that demonstration and let your voice be heard. But I will make my own plug. I am not a fan of Antifa, because the moment you go in prepared for violence, you allow men like Donald Trump to say, you know, there are bad people on both sides. And I believe there's no better way to recognize and honor Leon Lewis than to remember his post-war words. He wrote, only in a unified America could the nation and its citizens achieve the true realization of the democratic ideal. Thank you. Thank you so much. Sure.
We want to thank you. I can tell you that as riveting as that was, I highly recommend getting this book. We want to thank you, and we'll take a moment. There are cards that will be passed. If you'd like to write a question, just raise your hand. A card will be passed you. I'd like to call now upon Leslie Maitland, the chair of our Amram Scholar Series, to give you a taste of what is coming up, and also to thank Leslie for all that she's done for our Amram Scholar Series. Leslie.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Professor Ross. This is a really fascinating story. And I must say, I hope you'll talk a little more about how it is that this story never came to light before. It's remarkable that you unearthed all of this fascinating historical saga, truly. So I do hope you'll all come back for further lectures in the series, and we have these beautiful cars out there in the lobby which have all the details on the back. Pick them up. But as people think about questions and write them out for Rabbi Lustig, let me just give you a brief taste of the schedule that we have ahead. On Sunday, December 3rd, our next lecture, join us for some pre-Hanukkah mirth as historian Eddie Portnoy discusses his often hilarious new book, Bad Rabbi and Other Strange but True Stories from the Yiddish Press. He focuses not on the successful Jewish immigrants who rose to prominence in America and made it into history books, but rather on downwardly mobile Jews whose follies and foibles captured headlines in the Yiddish press, among them murderers and thieves, psychics and beauty queens. On a more serious note, Amherst professor William Taubman, whose biography of Nikita Khrushchev won a Pulitzer Prize, will be with us on January 28th to discuss a new biography, this one on Mikhail Gorbachev, his life and times. He tells a fascinating story of how Gorbachev, a peasant boy, rose to lead one of the world's two superpowers and then dismantled the Soviet system with the acquiescence of the communist regime. This poignant personal portrait draws on interviews with Gorbachev himself. On April 15th, Francine Klagsbrun will be here to talk about another world historical figure, the subject of her new biography entitled Lioness on Golda Meir. Born in Russia, Meir immigrated to America in 1906, grew up in Milwaukee, and went on to become the iron-willed fourth Prime Minister of Israel. Before Passover, join us on March 11th when Alan Zweibel, a five-time Emmy Award-winning writer for Saturday Night Live and Curb Your Enthusiasm, will share his funny take on the holiday and the Exodus. He'll be talking about his new book, For This We Left Egypt, a Passover Haggadah for Jews and those who love them. And wrapping it up on May 6th, because we all need humor in these days, we'll have Professors Jeremy Dauber and Michael Krasny, who will close the season with a scholarly but witty examination of the special nature of Jewish humor. The authors of Jewish Comedy, A Serious History, and Let There Be Laughter will discuss the comedic archetypes of Jewish culture and the masters of Jewish comedy, among them the Marx Brothers, Woody Allen, Joan Rivers, Philip Roth, Sarah Silverman, and Jon Stewart. What's so funny, they ask, about Jewish suffering and struggles for survival? So I hope you'll come. Many thanks. And back to Professor Roth.
Thank you very much. I'm going to let you take this mic, and I'll...
I shut that off, so you need to just turn it back on. A rabbi who knows how to use a microphone.
So the first question is really a number of people asked, can you tell us a little bit more about why Leon Lewis's story was buried, in a sense, and a little bit about where the paper trail, in other words, where these, how they made it into the archives and how you had the access to these archives?
Well, part of the reason I think this story hasn't been known is because my generation of historians who came of age in the 60s, 50s, we saw civil rights, we saw the anti-war movement, we became overly focused on communism and anti-communism in the 30s and 40s. And what could we learn from the new left of the 30s and 40s and the struggles of our government persecuting anyone on the left, persecuting Jews, taking us into McCarthy era. And we ignored the history of conservatives, and not just conservatism, but really the far right. We ignored the John Birch Society, really ignored the Klan, thinking these days were over. And I think it's only been, for me at least, because I started this this I wrote, for me, lightning speed, 6 years. My other books were 9 to 11 years. And I just thought it was time. There's been a revival now in the scholarly world of writing about the roots of conservatism, the roots of the conservative revolution. And in my book, Hollywood Left and Right, I wrote a chapter on George Murphy and Ronald Reagan. And in writing that, discovered this history of conservatism in Southern California and their involvement and Hollywood's involvement on the right, not just McCarthyism, but in rebuilding the Republican Party. And I just thought it's time to focus on Nazis and fascists. And the only reason I came across this was by accident, because no one's written about Nazis and fascists well, there are a few things that are written in passing, but no one's done a study of them. And while I was writing a chapter on Edward G. Robinson, who was very active in the Hollywood Anti-Nazi League, I found a quote he had from Jack Warner, where Warner said, who gives a shit about making money when I've got silver shirts and Nazis marching in front of my studio here in Burbank? And I thought, oh, okay, I want to learn more about those silver shirts and Nazis marching there. And I went online and found a online sort of summary of a special exhibition held at Cal State Northridge, which is about, by car, 40-minute drive. It isn't that far, but it's LA, it's traffic. Called In Our Own Backyard, A History of Nazis and Fascists in Los Angeles. And I went out to the archive and thought, I'm going to take a look at the Hollywood Anti-Nazi League, what's going on. And there are well over 200 boxes just for this period. And they were impossible for me to penetrate quickly. And I thought, I don't want to write a book that's going to take me 15 years. And this was only going to be a page. And so I said, when I finish this book, I want to go back there. And I did. I went back to Cal State Northridge around 2011. And again, it took me several months to figure out what the story was until I found out that Joe Roos, the associate spy master, had left his papers at USC. And I went in, and there was an unpublished autobiography that he was writing with Len Pitt, who is the major historian at Cal State Northridge, who had brought the collection there. And I read the first 30 pages, and I literally jumped out of my seat, left the library because I wanted to be polite, went outside and called my wife and said, I know what the story is now. Because Roos put it all together, and now I knew how everything fit. And at that point, I just kept going to Cal State Northridge and spending about 4 years reading documents. Mainly it's there, but also I was in Chicago, New York, and DC going through the National Archives, and particularly down in College Park. And that gave me the story. And at that point I knew there was not only a book, but a really important book. And over the last 2 years, realizing, not anticipating it, and I have to tell you, I wish it wasn't a timely book, but it is.
So I want to ask a little bit more, because the relationship, how you began to focus in on Leon Lewis, which I think now mentioning about Roos's autobiography, it becomes clear. But what was the relationship, and you alluded to this, and you alluded to the book, that Lewis had no real training. He was as a spy, and and what seems to be clear in your book is that this wasn't an organic sort of thing, but was very much, he had a vision and a plan. Can you give a little bit more of the background, because I think it's fascinating what Lewis did, his background with the ADL, and some of that they share in the book.
Well, Leon Lewis was a man who believed in Tikkun Olam. He wanted to heal the world. And instead of going out to make money, he went to work for the ADL. He helped found Hillels on university campuses. He also was, for a while, the editor of the B'nai B'rith Messenger. He was going around the country, particularly in the Midwest, talking about anti-Semitism. He then started paying attention to what was going on in Europe. And when he joined the military, as I said, he joined as a enlisted man and quickly rose through the ranks and was in Europe for the fighting. He was in the Somme for the battle there. And he saw the rabbi and I were talking about this, he came back and talked about the horrors he had seen and how he had seen men simply killing other men who they never knew, they never met, because they were told they were the enemy. And it left him with an impression, if human beings would kill another human being simply because somebody told you they were the enemy, what if Americans were told the Jews were the enemy and Americans started killing fellow Americans who were Jews? And the other thing, so Lewis comes back and he's determined to make sure this isn't going to happen. As the rabbi said, he had no plans to be a spy master, but he was very organized. At one point, he was running the relief efforts after the war for the army in Europe and in Ireland. So he was a very organized man. He knew how to organize things. And once he realized that no one was going to do this, he knew he needed to step up, and it was incredibly well organized. Every spy had their own number, their own reports, and I have to tell you, the moments that are hilarious when you're in the archive and somebody looks at you because you're bursting out in laughter and they're wondering, what are you laughing about? Every spy operated on a need-to-know basis, and so I have reports, particularly of spies in the early 40s, talking about you've got to watch careful and put Chuck Slocum under surveillance because he's the most dangerous guy here. He's on the inner circle of every fascist group in the city, and if there's any sabotage, arrest Chuck Slocum. And there are others who are reporting on each other, as this guy is the worst Nazi of all, because he also recruited Germans who were disgruntled. Many Germans, and Schmidt, his first recruit, did it because he was embarrassed by his own country. And the interesting thing is when Leon Lewis recruited all these veterans, because other than one Jew at the beginning, everyone was a Christian. And he made it clear. They all knew they were working for a Jew. They knew Leon Lewis was a Jew. But the way, first of all, Lewis did something smart. He got both the disabled American veterans and the American Legion to approve his undercover operation as part of their Americanism committee, which he chaired in both organizations. So the American Legion, which has a history of right-wing activism in LA, was actually very sympathetic to Jews and they were also very anti-communist, but they were really anti-fascist. They were even more anti-fascist and anti-Nazi in the 30s because they saw them as, in fact, a greater danger at that moment in time. And so he just felt, if no one else was going to do this, I have to do this. I have to do this. And he continued and basically gave up his law practice until around 1946 when he stepped down as the head of what then became the Community Relations Committee, which Joe Roos would take over. And it became one of the leading interfaith groups in Los Angeles, talking about the need for interfaith cooperation, not simply toleration, but mutual respect.
So was there any other relationship between the OSS and besides Roos being trained by Marshall, and at the same time, did any of your research go and show that other than a Jewish lawyer deciding that this was important to do, was there any effort on the American government, or and you speak about this in the book, can you also elaborate a little bit about how the Red Hunt and the concern for communism really masked and gave the opportunity for the rise of Nazism in the country? Right, because the real villain of my book is J. Edgar Hoover, who I was telling Leslie before that when I first, maybe it was Joe, when I first submitted my manuscript to the press, it was 500 pages typed, and I knew it was way too long, and I asked my editor to help me cut it down. And one of the first things she said is, you've got to cut out all the stuff you have on Hoover here. Your hatred of J. Edgar Hoover is so palpable that people are going to think
you've got some personal vendetta and they're not going to believe you. So cut out everything except the worst stuff. And I did, but I was shocked. I thought I knew the history of the FBI and communism, but when you're actually going into the archives and reading this, first of all, one of the silver shirt leaders went in to talk to, he was the Klan leader, was the head of the Klan in L.A., of which Chuck Slocum was the head of recruiting for the Klan in L.A. And so he's talking to him when he comes back from an FBI meeting, and it's either 39 or 40, and he says, just beware of the FBI. They got 5 people in that office who are Jewish, but everyone else is on our side. It's on our side. The FBI paid no attention. As I said, when you look at their archives, there's nothing. You have the number 2 Nazi in America. And by the way, for the Nazis, LA was a far more important city than what they called Jew York. Because Jew York at that time had a mayor, Fiorello LaGuardia. Now, how many of you know that Fiorello LaGuardia's mother was Jewish? So that meant, depending on which side of the Jewish spectrum you are, Fiorello was a Jew. And in fact, he was deeply committed to protecting Jews. He made sure that the ports of New York were closely guarded against Nazi propaganda, materials, and spies coming in. And so the Nazis, again, they're not clowns. Don't ever believe for a minute they're clowns. And don't believe what's going on today is a clown show. It's not, because that's what people would like you to believe, because then you don't pay attention. Then it's just amusement. But they realized that they could go through Los Angeles, and the port of LA became the most important port for Nazis. They were sending in secret orders, money, illegal propaganda, and Gestapo agents through LA. And I know this because Hermann Schwen would go down to the docks, and it is a boom to historians that Hermann Schwen was a cheap SOB who not only stole from the kitty of the restaurant at Deutsche House, but would always claim his car was broken. And so Neil Ness, the other major spy in my story, would drive him down to the docks on a regular basis. And they would go aboard the ship together, and he would see the captain hand Schwen sealed orders. He could see the red seal. He could see him literally get money, and he could see the propaganda materials that the German government claimed it was never sending to America come through. And everything that came through the LA ports was then sent to the rest of the country.
So there's a number of questions. One, can you talk more about Lewis's relationship with Hollywood studios, actors over the years? It seems your book provides a new perspective on the myth of Jewish studio silence, quote, collaboration.
Right. The book that came out in 2011, I believe it was, The Collaboration, Hollywood's Plot, Pact with Hitler, is a terrible history. It's a teleological history that says, we know what happened. Why didn't the moguls do more to stop it? My book tells the opposite story, which is you can't look backward as a historian. You have to look from the point of view of these people. And I tried to write this. Many historians like to read detective stories and spy novels, and I'm one of them. And this is the first chance I've ever had to write my own spy story. And so I knew what I had to do is not get in the way of the story. And so I used the dialogue as much as I can without making it tedious of how do they see the world? How do they see what's going on? And Lewis, because he had been the ADL representative, starting in 1915, he was monitoring Hollywood films for anti-Semitic images and sending back notes on films he had seen. And he really gets involved in 1927. He works with Edgar Magnin. He's still in Chicago, but he's working with Edgar Magnin. He travels to LA for the movie King of Kings to try to get rid of anti-Semitic overtones. And when he finally moves to LA in 31, he, as I mentioned, he remains the ADL's representative both for Southern California, and he stays on their special committees monitoring anti-Semitic images throughout the entire 30s and throughout the war years. And so he knows these men very well. And his real key allies, not Louis B. Mayer. Louis B. Mayer liked to talk a lot. Louis B. Mayer is one of these guys who would stand up at a meeting and pledge $10,000, which would be huge, and never pay the money. I got that from Harry Warner's daughter, who's a friend of mine, telling me what she just recently passed away, Betty Scheinbaum, telling me all this, how much her father hated Louis and would never call him for anything because you couldn't believe a word he said. But the key, Irving Thalberg was a man of his word, and Mendel Silverberg was a man of his word. And again, when Mendel, the key person for Hollywood was Mendel. As Leon would write, because Leon constantly kept writing back to Richard Goodstadt and Sigmund Livingston, who were in Chicago, still running the ADL, and he would give them regular reports. They were two of the only people who knew what was going on. And he would give them regular reports on the moguls. And when he got Silverberg to agree to oversee everything, he said, now we're set, because when Mendel calls, you do whatever he has to say. But Mendel Silverberg, by the way, born a Jew, raised a Christian scientist, and only came back to his Jewish roots during these years. And they had a very small committee. By the way, this is the only time in over 3,000 years that Jews have kept a secret. I found nothing about this in stuff I'd read. Maybe a little note here or there that there was some operation, but no one knew the full story. And there's one wonderful thing in Joe Roos's memoir. He talks about, we had these meetings every other Friday downtown at one of the Jewish Federation offices, and we would serve bagels and lox for lunch. And it was the first time Mendel had had bagels and lox. And he talked about how much he loved coming for these meetings because he loved the lunch.
So I want to, two final things. One is you mentioned in your book, and I think it's a really important point that we can't gloss over, that the stalemate and the inability of the American Jewish community to respond because of the lack of civility between Jewish organizations at the time, and it had to go public if Stephen S. Weiss had not organized Madison Square Gardens and brought out the 65,000 individuals on that day. American history may have, some believe, moved in a different direction on those things. Underplayed as well, Cordell Hall, who had a Jewish wife, in terms of his role, in terms of both being a facilitator and a stopper. Could you talk a little bit about Magnin and Weiss's role? And you know that Magnin had a radio show with a very prominent congregation in Washington in which they would swap pulpits and had a radio show. Rabbi Gerstenfeld and Magnin would swap pulpits, and they had a coast-to-coast radio show that went on in terms of it. So Magnin was very interested in working on making an effort of having influence on the East Coast because he believed we had to have a united look at and not siloed by our cities. So what were the influence of these rabbis?
Well, Stephen Wise had a major influence in the East Coast, but not the West. Stephen Wise was working with the lawyer Samuel Untermeyer, and they're the ones who launched, they said, let's hurt the Nazis where it hurts the most, because the German economy is very fragile, and we're going to start this international boycott of all German products. And again, until Germany stopped persecuting Jews and all minorities, not just Jews, all minorities. And the Nazis claimed it had no impact at all, and Weiss kept saying, yes, it does, and Untermeyer said, yes, it does. And I have a secret letter that I found from George Gissling in the records that in 1933, George Gissling was cooperating with his mentor, Hans Luther, who was the German ambassador to the United States, for a minute was the president of the Republic before Hitler came to power, and hated Hitler's guts, too. And in fact, what I learned from the correspondence I got in the Foreign Office is that most of the Foreign Office people hated Hitler as well. But they had to do what they had to do or else. Not dissimilar to, I have friends in the State Department who've been telling me about what's going on and the kind of discouragement that they feel today. So Stephen Weiss was an important figure in mobilizing Jews, and to have a loud Jewish voice. The American Jewish Committee, the key figure was Joseph Proskauer of the law firm Proskauer, Rose, and et cetera, et cetera. But on the West Coast, Magnin was the rabbi in LA. But Magnin also was more of the quiet type. He didn't want Jews to be too much in the public eye. He was more than Proskauer, but not quite as pronounced as Weiss. He thought it would backfire if Jews were too vocal. But on the other hand, he was an absolutely key person to getting Leon Lewis's operation funded, because he would talk to these moguls. He liked to boast that he was, Louis B. Mayer's best friend. He was always at Mayer's beach house on the weekends for a brunch on a Sunday. And that, again, just like Mendel Silverberg, when Rabbi Magnin called you and told you, I want you to do this, or I want you to give this kind of money, you listened. So he was a much quieter figure, but nevertheless an important figure.
So, I mean, that divide is always between political influence and financial influence has always been a divide in looking, because the East Coast, in terms of Weiss's political influence, and Magnin certainly had esteem. Let me ask you one last question that's come up in a number of these. What is your view and understanding of white supremacist and right-wing groups today in America, based on what you have learned from this book and as a historian?
Just go back to the Old Testament. I once asked my rabbi, how can good Christians, how can good Jews go along with this man who's been preaching hate today, who's been turning American against American? And he said, well, if you actually read the Old Testament and the New Testament closely, you're going to see that the vengeful God is actually more prominent than the loving God. And that through the years, many Christians have, and Jews, have taken the vengeful God. And I think we have had hate with us since Cain and Abel, if we believe at least the metaphor, if not the truth. And that those hate groups have never gone away. People always hate. And the question is, when do they surface? Because we've had the Klan with us since the 19th century. We've had the John Birches with us since the early 20th century. We've had silver shirts in this country marching since the 1930s. We've had hate groups and white supremacists all through this time. The question is not why why hate is with us. It's always been there. I think the more prominent question is hate surfaces when government authorities turn a blind eye to them. And when you have a president saying there are good people on both sides, I'm sorry. There are no good people on the white supremacist side. There are no good people in the Ku Klux Klan. Whatever you may think of yourself, you are not a good person. And to have a president who says, essentially, this is okay, is not okay. It's not okay, and that hate now has moved from the margins to the mainstream because these people feel they finally have a voice in Washington. They have a president who has their back, and anyone who says anything against them is just part of the fake news stuff. And here's what I would tell you. When you hear somebody say, oh, that's fake news, say, no, there is no such thing as fake news. That's lies that are being told by the right wing. MSNBC is not fake news. But one last thing, I was speaking in Jacksonville last week, and right after the talk, there was a moderator who was supposed to be the head of the ADL there, and he had a family emergency, so they called a member of the shul who was the local news anchor. And he made the big mistake that many do. They know more than the people who are writing about this stuff. So he went off script and went on his own jag about fake news. And right now all we have is right-wing media, Fox, and left-wing media, MSNBC. And I'm a guest, so I try to keep my mouth shut. But after he said that for the fourth time, I couldn't hold it in, and I just ripped him a new one. I said, for anyone who's grown up in the 60s, we know the difference between liberal and left-wing. We know the difference between conservative and right-wing. I don't love Fox, Fox isn't right-wing. They're really very conservative. The Daily Stormer is right-wing. The Nazi publications, the fascist publications in this country, those are right-wing. MSNBC is liberal. Bernie Sanders, left-wing. You know, get your facts straight, that there's a real difference. And I said, how can conservatives and liberals ever get together and find common ground if you equate them with the far right on one hand and the far left on the other hand? Words and labels really matter. And again, I would say to you, you know, what can every one of you do? Just remember, it was, I believe, Moses Maimonides who said, I don't ask you to be like Moses. I ask you to be like the best in yourself. And imagine if everyone in America, or at least 100 million Americans, because most of us say, well, what can I do? If you stand up to hate, if you say something when you hear it coming out of someone's mouth, as I said, if there's a demonstration and you go to it, it will stop people. And I can tell you in LA, my closest friend is the head of the National Lawyers Guild. And they found out there was going to be a neo-Nazi meeting in one of the parks of LA. They're going to have a rally. And he works with an interfaith council. And he called the ministers and rabbis and said, I want you to get your people out at this park. And then he called one minister of a black church and he said, I want you to get at least 60 people from your congregation to have a picnic in the park. That Sunday, there were several hundred people who turned out, and they had posted watch people all around the park, and they saw the supremacists come through in 2 or 3 cars, and they were looking, they circled the park, and they drove away. That's the impact that every one of us can have. Again, take yourself, multiply it by 100 million, and it changes everything in this country.
Well, we want to thank you for giving us a splendid work, and I hope you'll take a time. I highly recommend the book. We also want to, I think the most important message comes out, and it's not by any coincidence that that Lois and Joan picked this lecture to be the Goodman Lecture, because they were part of a whole group of Washington Jews who made and landed in Washington because of the New Deal. It was not the salaries that the government was paying. It was the opportunity to make the commonweal good. It was the opportunity to create, like Leon Lewis, a better America. And so I think at this particular time, the second opportunity that we've heard, Leon Lewis went on to become part of community relations and understanding that he understood and was only able to do this, which is clearly pointed out by Professor Ross's books, by the value of relationships. He had created the foundation of what he was able to do because as an ADL representative, as a person who worked with American veterans and had been a soldier himself, he had the relationships that allowed him to do good. So we have to continue as Jews to build stronger relationships, to remember to speak up, and to continue to encourage scholars like yourself to do work like this that is so imperative. We thank you very much. He'll be out in the, let's take you out real quick. We'll get you at the table.
If you're willing to buy a book, I am more than willing to sign the book.